A very good afternoon to you. On the business desk at this hour, the Finance Ministry is said to be the most watched portfolio under the national government of the Government of National Unity. It comes amid ongoing tough economic times in South Africa, and the new makeup of that ministry has been widely welcomed, along with the addition of Deputy Finance Minister Ashor Sarupen to the team, led by Minister Enoch Godongwana and Deputy Minister David Masondo, the DA leader who is among the youngest cabinet ministers in the 7th administration, has vowed to keep a close eye on fiscal prudence and guard against corruption. He's no stranger to matters related to the National Treasury, as he served as a DA shadow minister. The Deputy Minister speaks to us now. Thank you so much for your time. A pleasure to be speaking to you. Interesting times in South Africa where we see two Deputy Finance Ministers. Let's talk about how it is that you fit into this role.
Yeah, thank you very much. So obviously we had a series of negotiations. The Democratic Alliance was quite adamant that it needs a voice at Treasury because Treasury sits at the heart of economic policy making in South Africa. And a lot of our problems stem from South Africa's economic problems. And when we eventually reached an agreement to join the GNU, it included that we would get a Deputy Finance Minister position. And the party federal executive looked at who all was best suited for that job and thought that I was the right person to fill it. So that's how I ended up in the role largely.
And understandably, having served as a shadow minister within the finance department, then what would you say your cause is now actually having to work from within?
Yeah, so I think that what we need to focus on, obviously, are the things that we agree on that need to happen with speed. There are various structural reforms that need to happen in South Africa to get this economy moving, to create jobs, to get more growth, to get more tax revenues so that we can fix the big infrastructural issues as well. And these things can create a virtuous cycle that pulls South Africa forward again. And so that's going to be my focus primarily is looking at what we can do there. So in the presidency and in the finance ministry, there's something called Operation Vulindlela, which has been a series of narrow structural reforms around energy, around water supply, around broadband, and several other areas that can impactfully get growth moving. And that's one of the things I want to focus on. Obviously, fiscal prudence is quite important and making sure that we spend the money we have wisely, because South Africa is, after a decade of profligate spending, particularly between 2010 and 2018, not in a good fiscal space. So we've got to get...
Deputy Minister, pardon me for interjecting there, because you touch on a point that has been the subject of much critique, that as the DA, you are no longer serving as an opposition, but a part of a government of national unity. The issues around spending in particular have been debated for a historic period in South Africa, one of them being a bloated cabinet, and we now sit with an even further bloated cabinet. As one who sits in National Treasury now, how is that going to be tackled going forward, especially on the side of getting confidence from the South African public that it is indeed still something that needs to be tackled?
Yes, so there are a couple of things that we need to consider, and that is, what has caused bloat? Is it the number of people employed in South Africa, or is it the cost per unit of people employed in the state? Between 2010 and 2018, there were above inflation increases given across the board in the civil service that caused the headcount cost of every individual employee to skyrocket. And that has driven it. So we don't have, for example, enough police officers, enough teachers, and enough nurses. But we do have many, many people whose salaries are higher than they should be relative to inflation. And of course, these things are a balancing act because you don't want to trigger strikes, and you can't tell people they can get no increases, but you've got to strike the right balances. The simple reality is that economic growth can solve the fiscal problem. The more you grow the economy, the more tax receipts you get, the more revenue the government has, the fewer trade-offs you have to make. Right now, we're in a situation where you've got to make extreme trade-offs. And yes, you're right, on the outside, it's very easy as an opposition party to criticize and say this. On the inside, you've now got to act responsibly, and you've got to say, okay, where can we get the most impact? And the most impact right now sits on structural reforms, which is what I mentioned at the start of this. Getting those reforms into place to get the economy moving will help to alleviate the situation. A lot of good reforms were tabled but not acted on. A lot of them were acted on, but there's now phase 2 of Operation Vulindlela, which needs to be conceptualized and pushed through. And that will include a whole host of reforms in finalizing energy security so that we don't have load shedding, which has been a drag in growth in the first quarter of this year, caused the economy to contract. We need to get water security sorted. We need to reform the local government finance model because a lot of the failures in this economy that cause this problem sit with a poor local government finance model that now needs to be relooked at as well. And of course, corruption needs to be dealt with harshly. So those are the things. If we can deal with those low-hanging fruits and get growth in, then the conversations will be very different about, instead of cutting spending, we can start saying, what can we prioritize to get even more impact out of the state, the fiscus? Now, as I explained, the bloated cabinet is something you asked me about, and it's a fair point. The president and the leaders of the GNU, but the president himself has the sole right to appoint a cabinet, and he has decided that this is how he's going to manage the GNU. The Democratic Alliance would have preferred a smaller cabinet, and we were operating on the assumption that there would be 27 ministers. That didn't come to pass, but again, it is a constitutional prerogative of the president to deal with that.
You spoke of metrics that are needed in South Africa where spending is required, and I'm interested in your stance now, having to work within National Treasury with Finance Minister Kotongwana and Deputy Bab Masondo. Fiscal consolidation in South Africa, is that still the correct path?
Look, fiscal consolidation is part of the path because what you've got to do is contain spending so that you don't spend beyond your means. For the last 10 years, what we've had is revenue has been 27% of GDP, but expenditure has been 34% of GDP. And that gap has become a structural problem in South Africa's economy year in and year out. And as a consequence, we now have a baked-in deficit. And so the state has got to decide, again, what is spending is efficient and what is inefficient. And we've got to apply the principle of allocative efficiency to every cent that is spent. So fiscal consolidation is still necessary, and it must continue. But again, it only is necessary in the absence of growth. If we can pull all the right levers, if we can stop wasting money on bailouts and start moving it towards productive expenditure like infrastructure spend, infrastructure build, if we can make sure that infrastructure projects actually finish on budget and on time, we then can get this economy moving again. If we can sort out the ports and make sure they're efficient, we can sort out freight rail and make sure that goods can get to market and get exported. All of these things will deliver the necessary that will make fiscal consolidation less and less necessary. But of course, government must always be responsible, even in the good times, and not just in the bad times.
As a parting shot, your views on National Treasury having a role to play where the financial cushioning for South Africans who are cash-strapped and overstretched, to be honest, in current-day economics, is there one?
Look, again, once we look, we've got everything we do now has got to stay within the fiscal envelope. We cannot go beyond that. We cannot accelerate borrowing. So that's the first principle that you look at. But certainly it's been the position of the DA that for consumers who were squeezed, particularly poor households who've been affected by the food inflation crisis that we've had over the last few years, that we should expand the zero-rated VAT basket of goods for food and lower food costs for millions of South Africans upfront on essential things, bone-in chicken, soup, packeted soup, a whole host of vegetables and many other things. We've produced a full list and we've repeated it over and over. And certainly from inside National Treasury for cash-strapped South Africans, particularly for poor households who are battling with inflation, I will lobby very hard that we expand the zero-rated VAT basket.
We look forward to you lobbying on that particular point. Thank you so much for giving us your time. That's Deputy Finance Minister Ashor Sarupen. They're talking to us about his role in the particular 7th administration and the formation of a government of national unity.